This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on the dynamic trends shaping the legal world. Learn more at pli.edu/ftpod.
Welcome to Fast Tracked, Emergent Issues in the Legal Profession, brought to you by the Practicing Law Institute. I'm your host, Jen Leonard, founder of Creative Lawyers. Buckle up as we hit the gas and explore the most dynamic trends shaping the legal world. I hope you'll join us as we explore the future of law today. Welcome back, everyone, to Fast Tracked, PLI's podcast about all the really interesting and dynamic forces converging to drive an era of unprecedented change. On this podcast, we welcome guests who are thinking about all of those changes and helping support the professionals that populate the industry in navigating them well so that we continue to flourish in the future. And I am so excited today to be joined by somebody who does this very explicitly, supporting clients in navigating change. Welcome, Nina Blackshear. Nina is the owner and principal of Nina Blackshear Coaching and Consulting. Hello, Nina.
Hello, it's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Hooray.
Oh, thank you for being so generous with your time and expertise. We're so excited to dig into some of the really interesting things happening in leadership, in workplaces, in our individual transitions in our career. So I'd love to kick off by learning a little bit about Nina Blackshear. Tell us a little bit about your background, Nina, and how you came to be doing what you're doing today.
Absolutely. So I am a certified executive coach, but I'm also a practicing corporate attorney. I should probably say all of the views expressed today are my own. They do not necessarily represent those of my company. But I, like more people than you would think, I ended up going to law school because I had no idea what I was going to do after undergrad. I had an interdisciplinary liberal arts degree in political and social thought, which meant I was just not going to get a job, right? And everybody kept asking what I was doing, and everybody had always said I'd make a good lawyer. So I went to law school. And I think when you go to law school, you need to know why you're going to law school. You need to know sort of what the purpose is, because lawyers who are listening to this know it gets pretty grim about halfway through. It's a grueling journey. And I didn't have that sort of North Star to latch onto. And halfway through, I just thought, I don't want to do this. I don't like it. And I wanted to finish school. I wanted to take the bar. I didn't want to have student debt for nothing, but I was pivoting in a completely different direction. So I finished up and I was doing all the bar stuff. And then I graduated in 2001 and 9/11 hit. And I pivoted. I was going to be an event planner. And there were no events, there were no parties. People weren't celebrating much in the country. It was a very somber time. So now I'm just at home in my parents' basement wondering what's next. Through a sort of serendipitous introduction, I was introduced to a judge in the Superior Court of Delaware whose clerk was leaving during their second term, right when I needed a job. So I think he saw a warm body and was very excited to invite me into the role. So I learned a lot in that position. And I thought I can get back into this. I can get back into the law. There's some things I like about it. It's not just what you learn in law school, which is very different than the practice of law. But because law is such back then and still now, very conservative profession, it just didn't really understand if you stepped off that sort of very traditional first summer, second summer, maybe you clerked, treadmill. They didn't know what to do with me. And it was very clear that I wasn't going to be able to land a traditional firm job. So I had to pivot. And I was like, well, what else can I do? And I realized in Pennsylvania, you can sit for the real estate exam without taking classes if you are barred. So here I go. I'm going to do real estate. And I did that for a couple of years. The income was just sort of up and down, up and down. And I thought, okay, I need to do something more stable. So I did some contract attorney work on some pharmaceutical litigation. And somebody reached out to me from a major pharmaceutical company while I was doing that, as that project was wrapping up. And they said, we're standing up this new function in human resources called employee relations. We think with your legal background, you'd be a good fit. And so I transitioned into a pharmaceutical company doing HR. And I did employee relations for several years. And anybody who's done employee relations can tell you that it's very interesting and you have the best stories at cocktail parties. But it also starts to beat you down a little bit because your phone's only ringing with bad news, right? Mm-hmm. So I looked around, what else could I do? And I did some special assignments on top of my regular job and was able to transition over to marketing communications within that same company and worked on a number of different franchises. Then after a couple of years of doing that, my role was eliminated. And so then I pivoted. I had some contacts of some other people who'd left, and one of them was doing fundraising at a university here in Philadelphia. And she said, "Oh, I think he'd be great. That's a fundraising experience." And she's like, I can teach everything you need to know. So we boned up on fundraising. I interviewed for a job. I beat 30 other people out for a job for which I had zero experience. And I did that for a number of years, working the West Coast and doing major gift fundraising, developing very high EQ, asking people for $50,000 after knowing them for about 35 minutes. Maybe I'll ask you for $50,000 at the end of this conversation.
I don't know, Nina. You probably have learned from your experience that you were barking up the wrong tree. But you can try.
That's a lot of rapport. We got to build a lot of rapport. So did that for several years. But in between the marketing communications and the fundraising role, had met a lawyer who was in-house at GSK. She took an interest in me and said, I think you maybe had a bad experience. The law is bigger than what you thought. I was like, it's all in the past for me. She's like, let's stay in touch. We did. She moved to a different company and she reached out and she said, "I think you've got all the things I need for this role, for this very difficult and legally resistant client group. I need the EQ, right? I need somebody who's been on the business side. The legal nuts and bolts I can teach you." And she did. And so that's how I came in-house. And people always say, "Well, what firm?" I really didn't work at a firm. It was just more of a circuitous path. So that's been my journey. And then I was at that company for 6 years. And now I'm at my current company doing in-house. I'm a senior counsel doing in-house stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. And now you work coaching other executives and navigating their career transitions.
Yes. Just looking around and being very involved, particularly in the Association of Corporate Counsel here in the greater Philadelphia area, running into a lot of people, hearing a lot of the same complaints. I was used to giving a lot of advice to a lot of my friends, right? And at some point I had a friend reach out and say, "Oh, I'm so glad I got you on the phone. I needed my guru." And I was like, oh, I thought I was giving good advice to help people sort of build their own confidence. And I realized I was just creating codependence. And I didn't want that for my friends. And I thought, well, I need to look into what it looks like to really help people. And I sort of stumbled into the coaching field. And now that I love it and I love being able to help people, I say my love language is helping you discover your own power. And I love doing that for my friends. I love doing that for other people. And I particularly love doing it for lawyers because it can be such a rigid profession. There's a lot of pressure on us to show up. There's a lot of perfectionism. There's a lot of imposter syndrome. So there's just a lot of places I feel like I can help people discover how powerful they truly are.
That's fantastic. And so many parts of your story resonate with me as somebody who took a while to find my footing in the profession as well. And to your point, especially I think pre-COVID, I think COVID shook things up enough that people have a little bit more confidence maybe to take some risks that maybe they didn't before. There's like an existential component to that as well. Yeah. But it's still difficult when you have in your mind, these are the 5 or 6 different ways a law degree manifests as a career. And so many people really want to take their skills and use them to do something different. But it's really hard. I've been through it. You've been through it to actually figure out what that might be. So what advice do you have for somebody who is in the law and maybe not in the lane that they want to be in, but can't really figure out how to leverage their skills to do something else?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to stop just talking to other lawyers, right? I think a lot of us, it's a very insular profession, right? We go to happy hours with lawyers or we join associations that are all lawyers, right? Expand your horizons a little bit, even if that's in your personal life, right? So maybe it's just people through some social group, some kids' school associated thing, your church, right? You're bumping into people and not everybody's a lawyer. Be curious. Ask other people what kinds of things that they do. When I was trying to make that switch from HR to marketing communications, I didn't automatically know, oh yeah, marketing communications is my next step, right? I had conversations with senior leaders that I trusted at the company and said, I think I'm ready to make a switch, but I don't know what I don't know, right? And lawyers don't like to say that they don't know. But you have to get comfortable being okay with not knowing everything and not always being the smartest person in every room about every topic, right? You're just not. And so saying to somebody, here are the things I like to do. I like to communicate. I like to be a trusted advisor. I like to be creative. I like to work as part of a collaborative process. And I just, again, you have to kind of read the room and know where those safe spaces are, but being able to sort of take that pile of things that I'm like, this is what I like. And it might have been because I like things in certain jobs. So I'm piecing those things together and saying, here's the pile, and shoving it across the table at somebody who maybe knows my organization or knows an industry a little better than I do, and saying, what does that look like? What's the name of that? What's that job? And so that's how marketing communications kept coming up for me. And it became an avenue that I was interested in exploring, and I could be more thoughtful and purposeful about it. So I think that's important, is sort of expanding your network, talking to other people, being curious about other things, not assuming that you know everything, right? And the law, as I said before, it's rigid. From law school on, conformity is very much encouraged, right? You do not step out of line. You don't do anything non-traditional. You might need to take a step back, even concurrent with those conversations you're having with people, but it might be before, and say, I need to give myself permission to think a little bit more creatively, right? A lot of lawyers, that's the first hurdle for them, is to just think outside of, here's what has been sort of downloaded into my lawyer brain since I started my first day of law school about what this profession looks like, or what I look like when I'm a lawyer. I have a JD. Unwinding that might take a little bit of time, and just give yourself some grace around that.
That's great. And I love the advice about getting out of the lawyer space and meeting other people. Not only does it open your mind, I think, to what else is possible, I think it really strengthens your ability to lead projects and lead teams when your network isn't only lawyers, right? If somebody needs some expertise on marketing or finance or creative, to be able to have in your network people you trust and tap into them as well, I think makes you a more multifaceted leader.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about leadership, Nina, because as you note, there are many sort of hallmarks around being a lawyer, being part of this profession. One of the wonderful things, I think, for people entering the profession is that lawyers frequently end up in leadership roles, whether or not they're trained for it formally, and we are not trained for it formally. We end up there. And so there's so much discussion in the last decade or so about being an authentic leader, bringing your authentic self to a position. And I think that people really gravitate toward that idea. And yet it's really hard to define exactly what that means. And we see some people maybe engaging in behavior that's not super professional under the banner of authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So what does authentic leadership actually mean in practice for you?
Yeah, I think so. Here's the thing. The word authentic is sort of agnostic, right? The word authentic doesn't necessarily mean all good or all bad things, right? It just means being authentically you. So you can be an authentic leader and being very true to yourself. And if you're a terrible person, it's probably going to create a terrible environment for people, but you're being authentic, right? So I think looking at it sort of out of that spare space, I am doing a bit of a slant on authentic leadership in terms of what I think authentic leadership should look like, right? And it is a personal journey. But I think, first of all, there's self-awareness, right? You've got to know yourself inside and out, the good, the bad, the ugly. You can't just keep shoving the things that you don't like or you haven't dealt with or addressed under the carpet and thinking that you won't keep tripping over that ever increasing lump under the carpet, right? You will. So I think self-awareness is a big piece of it, because until you embrace every piece of who you are and what you bring to the table, it's going to be really hard for you to show up authentically, because you're actually sort of being inauthentic even with yourself, let alone how can you show up authentically for others. I think for me, authentic leadership includes things like transparency and vulnerability and kindness and compassion, empathy, vision, those kinds of things, right? Because I just think that people spend too much time trying to fit themselves into this cookie cutter mold of what they think a leader, quote unquote, looks like, how they speak, how they dress, how they present, what gender are they, what color are they, what height are they, whatever it is, where did they go to school, right? Versus forging their own path and putting people first, right? And people will gravitate towards that. People know when you care about them and their outcomes. And I understand when you're a senior leader, sometimes you have to make tough calls, right, that are going to impact people. But people know if you're making those kinds of tough calls, and you authentically and compassionately still care about the impact, even if you can't influence, the outcome. I think too many people, again, sort of just have this sort of, I don't know, like this old school Mad Men-y, Wall Streety, vision of what a leader looks like. And they think I've got to sort of ape that. And I think that unfortunately, it has looked a certain way in our country, historically. And there's been a certain amount of reward for people who maybe don't look like that to hew as closely to that as they possibly can. And I just think that there's a different way. And I think that you see companies where that is successful. And I also think as time moves on and these generations start to kind of file through the workplace, they're going to be looking for something different. So yeah, I think I personally, selfishly want people to show up in all the ways that I just listed. But people have to figure out what that means for them.
And I want to come back to this topic of intergenerational dynamics in workplaces. Before I do, I have a quick question for you, because you strike me as somebody who has natural leadership qualities. You mentioned that people come to you for, just flattering all over the place. But truly, like you mentioned that your friends come to you for advice and you realize that they might become dependent on you. So you took it upon yourself to become trained and educated in how to help others.
Mm-hmm.
That strikes me as something that a real leader would do, a servant leader, I guess. It's not taught very broadly in law school, all the concepts of leadership. And then when you get into legal workplaces, frequently it's not part of your professional development. So I guess first, do you think leadership is something that you can learn? And second, if it is something that you can learn, how do you think the profession should shift in terms of the way it prepares people to ascend to these positions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I absolutely do think that leadership is something that you can learn. And look, it's not just lawyers, right? This happens in lots of different career columns where people get promoted because they're really good individual contributors with no regard for how they might actually lead a team, right? They say, what do they say? People don't leave companies, they leave bad managers, right? So your direct manager has more influence over your day-to-day experience probably than anybody else. And so when we put people in a position to manage other people and to influence and impact their day-to-day cultural experience in the workplace, whether it's at a firm or a corporation or an higher ed, that's another place where I see a lot of this. It's on the organization to provide the right kinds of tools. And it's not like a one day manager toolkit, workshop, and that's the end, that people are just kind of multitasking and checking their email all the way through, right? I think for lawyers in particular, it would be great to start it in law school, right? The proverbial look to your left, look to your right. One of these people won't be here, at the end of the semester. Think about how the Socratic method is very sort of eat or be eaten. You watch somebody wither in front of you because they didn't know the answer, and then you know the answer and you get congratulated and they get humiliated. Like just the sharp elbows that are filed to a point in law school, and then we take those through, and people take those through to a firm, right? And then they're there for, they're expected to be an individual contributor, a cog in the wheel, and then all of a sudden they're put in charge of a team. I think there's a bunch of inflection points where that training could happen, right? It could happen in law school. A friend of mine down at University of Houston, a school of law, I believe, is doing a leadership seminar, right? Lawyers as leaders. And so just kind of helping them with some of that EQ stuff that doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody, how to treat people with dignity and respect. Again, not necessarily things that are encouraged in our profession. So I think that it could happen there. I do think that law firms can differentiate themselves by implementing that. I get it. The billable hour is still king, but more, and I'm on the in-house side, right? More and more, we're looking for interaction with lawyers who understand how we need to collaborate with our internal partners, right? So we need them to be displaying those kinds of skills. I need to feel comfortable if you're coming in to do a presentation and it's going to be, involving some of my clients, that you're going to know how to navigate that space. So I think that law firms have an opportunity to do that. And then certainly once you kind of transition to the in-house, I do think there are more resources, because I do think that corporations just sort of holistically look at how to help leaders to take that next step, or managers to take that next step. But I think that the opportunity is there. And if your company or your firm isn't doing that, or even if a law student's listening to this right now and there's nothing like that at your school, like there's a ton of stuff on LinkedIn Learning or, online. You can find a ton of different things where you can bulk that up for yourself. And actually, that's a really great way for you to differentiate yourself among your colleagues.
100%. And I think you're right. I think that we're moving toward improvement in valuing some of the leadership skills that really will differentiate organizations, firms, and those kinds of things, which is good because we are now being faced with so many new challenges that even leaders 10 or 20 years ago weren't grappling with. So it's good that we're starting to upskill ourselves. But one of those major challenges is this is the first time in human history where we have 4, potentially 5 different generations trying to coexist, trying to achieve a common aim with lots of different value sets, with lots of different world events that have shaped their perspective. And then, of course, we're coming out of a pandemic where we're in fluid work environments. So what intergenerational challenges in your work, Nina, do you see manifesting the most? And how can leaders and professionals try to navigate them effectively?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is that there seems to be a very much a them versus us mentality, right? And I think it divides, not always neatly, right? But roughly among that sort of Gen X and boomers are on one side of that fence, and then millennials and Gen Z are on the other side of the fence, right? And I have a webinar that I do on authentic leadership, and I always take a pause in the middle with a slide to tell both sides, both camps, right, that I have a news flash for them, like for each of them, right? And so for the boomers and the Gen Xers, and I'm a firm Gen Xer, just
Same.
saying, right?
We're obviously the best generation.
Obviously,
Is
right. Also the forgotten one. I love when they list generations and I'm like, we just get left off the list. I'm like, we're taking care of literally everything right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm very happy to be left off the list.
Just leave us alone.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Just let us ride our bikes until the street lights come on. That's all we want. Then we'll come in, take care of our brothers and sisters, and get dinner started.
We'll do it all. We don't have time to be paid attention to.
Good times, memories. But just the newsflash for the boomers and the Gen Xers is like, time is inexorable, and these generations are coming, like whether you like it or not, right? And that they, as I mentioned before, they're looking for a different kind of work experience. They're looking for a different kind of leader. And I think that we have to make a decision. Do we want to be part of that future, or do we want to sort of, be so rigid in 5 days in the office and that's the only way? It's not the only way, right? There's actually, as lawyers, we learn, hopefully, there's not one way to do anything. There's 9 different ways to draft a contract, and they're all going to be just fine, right? So having, opening our minds, again, sort of that rigidity and the conformity of the law, like let's think a little bit more creatively and embrace, because at the end of the day, they're coming and they're the leaders of tomorrow. And it's up to us to download our historical knowledge, not impose this is the only right way, but say, here's some things that we've learned. It will be helpful to you as you start to assume leadership. On the flip side of that, my newsflash to, the millennials and the Gen Zers is, the Gen Xers and the baby boomers, we're still here. We're still in the workplace. And most of us are in charge, right? So it would behoove the younger generations to learn how to bridge that divide, right? With some diplomacy and quite frankly, with, I want to use the word respect carefully, just respect for the fact that people who've gone before you, they do know something, right? I'm not saying that means you have to adhere to everything that they're doing, but understanding again, that's a differentiator. When you know how to speak to people who are currently in leadership roles, are sort of running the show, and making them understand that you understand, and that you also understand their path and their journey, and that some of them have forged the path that you walk today. I think that would go a long way to it. So I wish that more people thought about it as it's us, it's not, or it's we or whatever, but it's not us and them,
Mm-hmm. And where do you see the balance, Nina, in your coaching or in your work generally, between thinking through some of the defining characteristics of an entire generation? This generation, maybe Gen Z, came up in such a state of chaos and turmoil, so they must be disloyal to institutions as a result, where, like you said, Gen Xers, we were sort of taking care of ourselves. So we're much more independent, right? Like there are common themes, and then there are individuals, right? So there might be Gen Zers who are extremely loyal and want to stay with their organization for a very long time. And there might be people like us who were coddled, and they weren't on their own. So how do you leverage the strength of different generations across sort of the defining characteristics of that generation, while also promoting some of the individuality and unique traits people bring to the table in sort of dialogue across those generations?
Yeah, I do think that's part of the art of being a leader, right? And unfortunately, managers get squeezed because managers have to lead, but they also have to be doers to some extent. So they're kind of juggling it all. And that's a tricky place to be. But I do think that's part of the art of it, is to understand sort of, right, those broad brush strokes across the generations of what might be some of the hallmarks, or what might be some of the events that shaped us, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many Gen Xers I talked to who are shaped by the fact that we watched the Challenger explode on TV in real time, right? Millennials maybe talking about, being in high school and watching 9/11 on TV, or watching the bubble burst, when the economy completely tanked in 2008. I think so maybe looking at some of those broad strokes and what we think of, independence or drive or social consciousness that we assign to various generations, and maybe stop if it's just because it's different than how you look at things or how you were brought up or what your generation kind of sits in, maybe putting a positive spin on that first, right? How can I harness that for good? Right. Mm-hmm. And then stepping back from the generalizations and understanding that the other layered nuance of it is that you do have to understand that people are individuals. I do want to speak about that whole, can I speak really quickly about that disloyal sort of narrative that's out there? I saw less so my sister, right? She's sort of just on the cusp, right? She's just like the last year maybe of Gen X, but she kind of really millennial. She was home when my parents were impacted by what happened when the economy tanked, what happened to my father's 401k and all of that. And so it's not about being disloyal. I think they were the first generation to say, oh, it's not a guarantee. You don't necessarily get to work somewhere and get a gold watch at 50 years and a party, and then you get to go, I don't know, golf in Florida for the rest of your life, right? And so the boomers were finding it out in real time because it was literally, their stuff was just evaporating. But when you think about the kids who were watching that happen, who were in the homes, watching their parents go through this very traumatic time, why would the trust of the corporate structure be there, right? So it's not disloyalty. It is trust but verify. I don't know. And it's being guarded and saying that's going to keep me safe because I watched my parents rely, and I watched how unsafe that became so quickly, not just for them, but maybe for our entire family. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the sauce.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's more of a self-reliance based on, what you're observing. I can't necessarily have confidence that this is going to support me, whatever this is, from an institution, a career, wherever you live, whatever it is. Right. So much of what you are talking about, Nina, is about scrutinizing, questioning, being curious about your mindset and the mindset that you bring to your work. And you've had such an interesting journey doing so many different things. Some things you learned that you loved, some things you learned the hard way. So what's a lesson through all of your experiences that you learned the hard way that helped you shift your mindset that you would pass on to somebody just getting started in their own career journey?
Okay, so I'm going to do a positive and then sort of not a negative, but more of a learning. So I think the positive for me is because I had to make so many different shifts and pivots, it really gave me confidence that I could do almost anything. If it's not putting a man on the moon or opening a man's chest up, I'm probably going to figure it out, right? So variety in my career, even though it may have seemed chaotic along the way. And I, unlike people who came up in a narrow vertical, sort of legal career who have a, house in the Hamptons. I do not have a house in the Hamptons, but I do have unshakable confidence that I can jump into something and I'm going to figure it out. So that was a lesson that, there were bumps and bruises along the way, but you get scrappy. And then I would say the other thing that I've learned and I've tried to pass on to people, and it impacts more people than I thought it would, is be careful what you're looking for at work, right? I have a very difficult relationship with my mother, and I was looking for some of what I was missing from her at work. And I kept, work is not the place to find love, right? In that way, or approval, but I was looking for it. And I realized how much that, at some point, I realized how much that was tripping me up over and over again. It just kept kind of raising its head in slightly different ways in different situations. So I think be careful what you're looking for at work. I tell people all the time, I don't look at work to make me happy. I hope that I'm not unhappy in what I am doing at work, but I look to a bigger life, like my outside life, for my happiness. And that takes a lot of the pressure off of what you're hoping for when you step into that door or you log onto that computer every day. I think if you're seeking full-on happiness from work, you may be setting yourself up for chronic disappointment. So again, I would, it's a shifting the perspective, broadening the vistas. What else can you do out there that isn't just this one thing? I think that it really helps and it stabilizes you.
Those are such great takeaways. The confidence to know that everything is figure outable for you as you go, and having confidence in yourself. And also, I love the last one, like really think about what you're looking for in work. I noticed explicitly on some conversations I've heard on podcasts, the shift pre-COVID and post-COVID that organizations would talk about being your family and you're part of the family.
Yeah.
And we learned, when push comes to shove and there's an emergency, their work is not your family. And I've seen some interesting takes on thinking more about a team and an athletic endeavor together, that you're not guaranteed to be together forever. You're coming together for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
So I love that framing. And I think it's really useful for a lot of people. Well, Nina Blackshear, I just want to thank you for your wisdom, for your generosity to others, and for spending time with us. So where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can go to my website, which is ninablackshear.com. Easy peasy to remember. And if they wanted to chat, you can book a free 30-minute discovery call. We can talk through, what your coaching needs are. So I would love to work with any of your listeners who are ready to level up to what's next and overcome limiting beliefs. And remember, my love language is helping you to discover your own power. So let's go.
Love it. Love it. Well, Nina Blackshear, thank you so much for spending your time here with us today. I know everyone learned a tremendous amount that they can take and immediately apply in their work, wherever that might be. And I want to thank everybody out there for tuning in for our conversation today and for continually coming back to Fast Tracked Conversations to learn more about how you can turbocharge your own career during these interesting and exciting times. Until next time, be well, and we'll see you again on Fast Track. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation as much as I did. Visit pli.edu for more insights, education, and resources for navigating this dynamic landscape. And until next time, stay curious and stay adaptable as we work together to chart a course into an exciting future.